One of the hottest topics right now in the video game industry is cloud-based gaming. Being able to stream games whenever you want from a console, mobile, desktop. It could be a game that's part of a subscription-based catalog. It could be a game that you already own, and thus you're entitled to play it and stream it whenever. And the funny thing is that throughout PlayStation history, we've seen that Sony likes to experiment quite early with these initiatives and technologies, and we can see going back as early as 2006, we have remote play from PS3 to PSP, which was so cool, quirky, and not even all that useful, but let's take a look. Assuming you were a very active PlayStation customer back then, owning a PS3 and a PSP made a ton of sense with the practicality of how they work together. The only other examples we saw prior to that was anything Nintendo offered from their portables, and there were certainly a handful of things you could do when connecting, say, a Game Boy Advance to a GameCube or a DS to a Wii, but there was really more practical functions a PS3 and a PSP combo served. This was still pre-smartphone era, at least initially, so for a brief time, it wasn't exactly weird to use a PSP as a multimedia device. So you'd either transfer your files from a PC, or you could use a PS3, and this was usually a very simple process. Connect via USB, and then copy away any of the picture, music, or video files you want. I used to do this all the time because PS3 for me was usually acting as a hub with all my main files, utilizing the larger hard disk drive space. Then I'd delete and copy as needed on PSP since I didn't have nearly as much space there. The other crucial part to this was being able to download any PSP content items from the store on PS3 and copying those over as well. It could be native PSP content that the PS3 cannot play, or PS1 classics, but this was an excellent way to manage and store PSP games. This is even more important today now that Sony has closed all PS Store functions directly on PSP hardware, so if you're still looking to move around, store, and buy new PSP games for PSP hardware without using a Vita, a PS3 is the way to do it. And outside of the finicky, slow store, the error codes, and the wallet top-ups, it's still relatively straightforward and easy to use, even to this day. Now, of course, the big thing here was playing PS3 games and streaming those to your PSP, which you can do, but it's severely limited, to the point where you have to ask yourself, why did they even bother with this as a feature? But let's take a look. We've got remote play here, ready to go. We're going to select that, and we can do it over internet or private network. Internet would be if you turned on remote start on your PS3, so you can leave the console off, and then you can go to a friend's house, you can go to another state, another country, and over internet, it should remotely wake up your PS3, and you can control it that way, which was very cool, but even more novel than the basic private network feature, which we'll do that. We're right next to my PS3, and that's where we can get a somewhat stable connection in terms of image quality and also trying to reduce the latency as much as possible, because that's the big thing here. And we're in. You can see that it looks pretty good, actually. It's been a long time since I've seen remote play on PSP of all things, and the image quality is not too bad, at least when we compare it to something like, well, you know, a lot of people might be familiar with something like Stadia or Xbox Cloud Gaming, you know, over xCloud, and of course PlayStation Now, where just recently we did some coverage on that, and there's still some very noticeable compression in the image when you're playing those, say, PlayStation 3 games, and it looks even worse if you're playing PS4 stuff. On PSP, on the smaller screen, doesn't look too bad, but it's pretty limited. Now, obviously, you can do simple things like look at your pictures if you want. I've got 3 versions of Typhlosion here, but this is a PS3 that has it's relatively new to me, as in, you all know my old system, I lost the vast majority of my data when I changed my PSN ID in the name of science to see what would happen, but you can look at pictures just fine. Music will work as well, so you can get a quick look at my very strange, bizarre music tastes, but music will absolutely play. Some old whiz here, and that'll work. But now also I have to mute that, so you can't hear it, but I assure you it's on there. And you know, the XMB looks pretty good on PSP. With TV and video, this is pretty noteworthy as well. So your video files will play like Persona 4, the animation I have here. These will all load up, and you could, in theory, watch these. It's being a little slow. But you see Robin Big right here. That was a show from MTV, and these I actually bought from the PlayStation Store when Sony used to offer TV and video. as a purchase and a download, and those will not work over remote play. You can see there's no titles. I don't know why they blocked that, but that will not be that won't display. And then some of these other applications, really the vast majority of applications that you try to start via remote play are not going to work, and that's going to include games. So for example, if I go to PSN titles, now what's funny is I'm already set on one game that will work, but most others will not. So let's scroll down to the bottom. Super Stardust, no. Magic Orbs, no. Shatter, no. Gran Turismo, no. I mean, we don't have to do much more. The vast majority of PlayStation 3 and PSN titles do not work via remote play. But there are a handful of games that do work, and that was very surprising at the time because that told us that developers do have the option to utilize this feature. So you can see that if I try PixelJunk Eden, which I believe all of the PixelJunk games do work, but PixelJunk Eden is going to start and play just fine. If it's a good experience, that's another question, I would say. You probably could have noticed when I was on the XMB, but there was a very noticeable defined input latency that you could easily notice on camera, right? Normally, if we're talking a few milliseconds, you might not be able to notice it via capture, but you'll feel it. This you can see right away. It's tough. You just would not want to play games like this. And that's why 17-something years later, most consumers still don't want to stream games. And it's a vastly better experience than this. But that's what was so interesting and novel back then, is that Sony did allow this. It was a proper feature, but most developers weren't doing it because, well, let's face it, it was kind of useless. And I believe this was also using a lot of the PlayStation 3's memory to make sure that this was possible, and PS3 was a bit limited on that. Most games, or at least most games in development, developers are always fighting for memory. So this was like a very low priority thing that most teams did not use. Now, that was a smaller native PS3 title via PSN, right? But Sony did make sure that every PS1 classic was playable via remote play. And that was nice. Granted, you would just want to transfer the game to your PSP as normal so you can play it locally, but they did ensure that all PS1 classics via PSN could be remote played. Always fun to play Tomba, but it's so hard to play. And that's what, that's what we're saying. Like, this just isn't very useful. And you could maybe get used to like the nearly half a second or what feels like a second long input delay. That's no way to play. And the issue is just exasperated over internet. So if you do the long distance remote start, it's gonna look worse and play worse. It's like, it's a tough sell. So all your digital PS1 classics will play, and that's cool, but again, you would just transfer them locally and play that way. But one thing that maybe is lesser known, you'll see I have a PS1 disc in here. Before, you couldn't remote play PS1 discs. Then a firmware update allowed every PS1 game via disc to be played via remote play as well. Now that was super interesting because in theory, if you also wanted to do it via internet, just make sure you have the PS1 disc inserted that you want to play, and that will work. And that was actually somewhat handy if you wanted to play something that wasn't available to be played locally on PSP, right, where it's not available as a PS1 classic. So for example, Tekken 3, which as far as I know, Tekken 3 is not on the North American PSN as a PS1 classic. As I've admitted to you all plenty of times, I am a button masher with fighting games. So this is gonna be really ugly. Not very good gameplay at all. But to Sony's credit, I mean, this is what was so great about, back then. They had a ton of PS1 classics on the PlayStation Store. So chances are, the game that you were looking to play might have already been on PSN. But on the off chance that it wasn't on there and you couldn't buy it, let's say you still had the disc, you could do this. So we've looked at PSN games, PS1 classics, PS1 disc games. Are there any PS3 disc games? The answer is yes, but there's like 4 or 5 games. It's even smaller of a list, and one of them that does work is Lair on PlayStation 3, which is not even that good of a game, of course. Once this game was patched in for analog flight support, because when it came out, it was only primarily 6-axis motion controls. So once it got flight stick support, that's when it was able to be used via remote play on PSP. So there you go. We've actually got PSP button prompts to tell us how to play. Oh, this is so bad. I'm trying to remember though. Maybe this was playable before the analog flight patch, because technically the button prompts were already asking me to use I'm using the directional pad to control flight, and the analog stick is only to change flight direction. So maybe it did work before the patch, but either way, it's playable. And that's essentially it. I mean, we're talking 35, 40-something PS3 native games that were playable via remote play to PSP, and even less for disc-based titles. So for disc games, it was like 3 or 4. It was a very, very small list, but in theory, it was part of the SDK. Developers could absolutely support it and even do custom button prompts. It was all there, but throughout that entire life cycle, yeah, it was not widely used. But there are other examples that I'm likely showcasing to you right now, and if you do play them over internet, that's where it is going to be a lesser experience. So there's a lot to be desired, a lot left to be desired here, but it was still such a crazy thing to know that this was playable, or at the very least possible back then, right? So at the time, it was still very much a novel, experimental thing. You did it 1 or 2 times, maybe you showed it to a friend. There was no reasonable way anybody would play a game from start to finish like that, but it was still interesting to see Sony go ahead and do it and support it. And there's many examples in PlayStation history where Sony has done that, right? They're never really known for completely pioneering certain spaces, but certainly they are there very early for things like, iToy, remote play, even Gaikai streaming, where that, PlayStation Now predates things like Stadia and Game Pass, right? They were there very early for that. They were investing in that space. They were ahead of their time, right? So, yeah, it's just so limited in its scope and capacity with remote playing to a PSP, and it was slightly expanded and supported for a very short time on PlayStation Vita. We haven't really spent too much time talking about that. At least on PlayStation Vita, that was something where a few more disc games were supported, but again, it's a very small list. The God of War collection on PlayStation 3 was supported, so there's one example for you, but when it came to PlayStation 3, the support wasn't really there, and we all know what ended up happening was Vita and PS4 were designed in such a way where every single game, it was mandated that PS4 titles are playable on PlayStation Vita, which was also very cool and far more usable. I would still argue it was not really the best way to play a PS4 game, but at the very least, we saw that Sony did expand and double down on remote play functionality. And we even see it today on PlayStation 5 with smartphones and tablets. But they really did experiment with this stuff 16, 15-something years ago, and they still allowed it as a consumer-facing feature to at least play around with and perhaps gather a lot of valuable data and insight on how consumers were using it and toying with it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at Mystic Ryan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.